This session is on public-private partnerships to catalyze infrastructure development and innovative financing for industrialization in Africa. All my panelists, just to come up to the stage. I will introduce you later. So please, if you can just move up to the stage. I already said that this session we are going to deal with public-private partnerships for infrastructure development in support of industrialization. My name is Robert Lisinge. I am the officer in charge of the Private Sector Development and Finance Division of ECA. I am also the chief of the Energy, Infrastructure and Services section of ECA. Now, we all know that infrastructure financing is a big problem in Africa, but many people don't know that even though it's insufficient, African governments still finance the bulk of infrastructure development on our continent. But now with increasing challenges, growing costs of borrowing, debt to GDP ratios that are quite high, the fiscal constraints that our countries have makes it difficult for them to meet all the infrastructure requirement in trillions of dollars if we're going to meet the SDGs. Regarding the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, we need more than 169 billion USD. So the need to crowd in the private sector becomes very huge. That is why at ECA, I've been working with African countries to try to build their capacity to enhance private investment through PPPs. We've done some diagnostic studies in 6 African countries. We've helped them, assisted them to develop action plans to enhance PPPs. We are undertaking capacity building for relevant PPP units. And also we are mobilizing resources. We've been going to investment conferences in China, Abu Dhabi, with a number of African countries. So I'm pleased that we have some of the countries that we have been working with today. We have about 40 minutes, and I have a very strong panel that I will introduce to you. The first person I would like to introduce is Ms. Eniye Ogwebo. She is from the World Association of Public-Private Partnership Units and Professionals. She's also with the International Senior Lawyers Project. So this is somebody who has a lot of experience and knowledge with PPPs. I also have with us Ms. Asen Honore Gideon. Is a public-private partnerships expert. He's also a lecturer of economics and management at University of Yaoundé too. And finally, the last but not the least, we have Ato Getahun Moges, former Director General of Ethiopian Energy Authority. So you see that my panel comes with huge experience and knowledge in PPPs. I'm going to, in terms of process, pose a number of questions to the panelists, and also hopefully we will have the time to interact with those of you who have come to this session. So I will go to my seat and I will start asking the questions. Could you briefly tell us, describe to us based on your experience and knowledge, the current PPP environment that you see on our continent today? I know that you have a rich experience working with many African countries. How do you see the environment for PPPs?
Thank you very much, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just start by saying a very big thank you to UNECA for extending the invitation and for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this very important discussion. I would like to just start by saying that infrastructure development is critical for sustainable and inclusive development. It would interest you to know that at least 6 of the Sustainable Development Goals are actually directly linked to infrastructure development. So when you look at access to access to clean energy, affordable and clean energy, clean water and sanitation, sustainable cities and communities, industry, innovation and infrastructure, climate action. You can see there that the underlying theme is actually ability to sort of put in the right infrastructure to achieve these SDGs. So we really cannot divorce those two discussions, sustainability and infrastructure. And that's why I think the theme for our session is quite topical in this regard. I would just like to also speak about the infrastructure gap that we see in Africa. A number of speakers have already touched on it, where according to the African Development Bank, we're looking at a funding gap of around $100 billion per annum to bridge that infrastructure gap on the continent. And it's clear that government alone cannot, sort of rely on their budgetary allocation to sort of meet the infrastructure needs of the continent. So again, although this gap is there, it poses a challenge, but therein lies the opportunity to sort of bring in the private sector, because I think the private sector is key to sort of solving or bridging this gap. And this is where I see a role for PPPs. PPPs, which stands for public-private partnerships. And just for the benefit of people in the room, PPPs are really a way by which government can procure critical infrastructure projects and services by leveraging private sector resources, expertise, and innovation under a risk-sharing arrangement. So of course, there are lots of arrangements. People assume when the private sector and public sector enter into an agreement, it's a PPP. It's not necessarily a PPP. It could be a joint venture. It could be a partnership, any other partnership or collaboration. PPPs are very specific, and it's really about risk allocation and risk sharing. In terms of the PPP landscape in Africa, I think I really enjoyed the opening remarks by Professor Umana from the African Development Bank, where he sort of painted a very vivid picture on the sort of unique position Africa sits in, with a population of about 1.4 billion and counting, with Africa having the youngest population in the world, with about 60% of the population being below 25%. So I think the opportunities are endless. It's just for us to be able to sort of harness the potential we have and unlock the possibilities that are, in my view, endless. So in this context, I think PPPs can actually be a critical tool if structured and implemented properly. There's been a lot of criticism about PPPs as well. So it's also very important for organizations like UNECA to sort of really strengthen their institutional capacity in terms of helping, particularly the government side, in their screening, identification, and appraisal of projects for their suitability for PPPs. I'll just pause there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, the need to strengthen institutional capacity came out very strongly, but I will come back to you. For now, Asen, the same question to you, based on your experience and knowledge, how do you see the PPP environment in Cameroon in particular?
Okay, thank you for the invitation. I'm going to discuss in French. Merci pour l'invitation. De façon globale, l'environnement des PP au Cameroun, je vais parler de l'environnement macroéconomique, environnement sociopolitique, peut-être même dans le cadre environnemental. Je pourrais aussi ajouter quelques éléments au niveau des institutions. Alors, le Cameroun fait face à plusieurs défis. Nous avons des crises, Boko Haram, l'instabilité socio-politique dans les régions anglophones. Nous avons l'instabilité qui a eu lieu en RCA, qui affecte le Cameroun du fait des réfugiés. Nous avons des problèmes, nous sortons du Covid, qui a affecté l'équilibre macroéconomique du pays. Nous avons les crise liée au changement climatique. Alors, ce que je veux dire ici, c'est que malgré ces crises, malgré ces problèmes, l'économie camerounaise reste résiliente pour la promotion des PPP. Au niveau de l'environnement des affaires, en un mot, il est à améliorer. Lorsqu'on regarde beaucoup plus les indices produits par les institutions internationales, que ce soit Transparency, Global Competitiveness Index, l'indice des risques climatiques et autres. Alors, beaucoup de paramètres ne sont pas bien pour le pays, sauf par exemple au niveau des risques climatiques, où le Cameroun ne risque pas gros dans ce domaine. Maintenant, au niveau de la qualité du crédit, la qualité du gouvernement, la capacité du gouvernement à payer, à rembourser les dettes. Alors, les agences internationales classent le Cameroun au niveau des dettes à risque. Mais le commentaire que je peux faire à ce niveau, c'est que ce classement ne donne pas la meilleure information de la capacité du Cameroun à mettre en œuvre les PPP. Parce que lorsque nous sommes sur le terrain, on se rend compte que le Cameroun a une grosse capacité de mobiliser les fonds au niveau national, au niveau sous-régional, même à l'extérieur. Quelques chiffres, par exemple. Entre 2010 et 2020, le Cameroun a pu mobiliser plus de 3 000 milliards pour investir dans le secteur des infrastructures, dans le secteur notamment des infrastructures. Alors, au niveau des institutions, globalement, nous avons un problème de capacité. Pourquoi? Parce que le système camerounais voudrait que lorsqu'on veut initier les partenariats publics-privés, que chaque institution soit capable d'initier ces partenariats. Cela signifie que l'institution en question devrait avoir les capacités sur toutes les étapes des partenariats publics-privés. C'est ça qui fait que, globalement, lorsqu'on a initié les projets qui sont éligibles au partenariat public-privé, on se rend compte que beaucoup de ces projets, pratiquement 35%, n'atteignent pas l'étape de signature du contrat. Maintenant, environ 15% de ces projets qui ont atteint l'étape de signature du contrat ne sont pas mis en œuvre, ou alors commencent à être mis en œuvre, mais la mise en œuvre est interrompue avant la fin du contrat. Donc, ces éléments nous montrent qu'au niveau du Cameroun, l'environnement est marqué aussi par une faible capacité des parties prenantes à suivre les partenariats publics-privés. C'est ce que je peux dire à ce moment. Peut-être si d'autres questions viendront, je pourrais élargir. Merci.
Yeah, definitely, Asen, we will come back to you. But let me go to Ato Getahun. You have been the Director General of Ethiopian Energy Authority. Energy is a sector that we all know require huge investment. Given your experience and your knowledge in this sector and infrastructure in general, could you share your views on the environment, on public-private partnerships in Ethiopia?
Thank you, Robert. I also would like to extend my appreciation to the organizers of this conference for having me here and also for picking up a very timely and touchy subject on private sector financing of infrastructure, the most important yet the most challenging area. It has been now over 2 decades since development partners have been warning Africa at large that there is a huge gap in infrastructure financing across the continent. The gap, as earlier said repeatedly, is in the order of $200 billion. On top of this, Africa has a burden of debt repayment to the tune of 70 to 80 billion dollars. So the financial institutions, they were telling us that the traditional mode of financing, where public finance or short-term financing packages are no more available to the extent desired. And if all development partners come together, they cannot do meaningful leverage in terms of availing the gap. So they've been advising us to look for alternative finance. And there is indeed an alternative finance. That's what we call a private sector finance, unlimited resource, but with its own challenge. Since the late 80s, the government, we have tried to engage private suppliers. Went to the extent of signing head of PPA agreement and detailed PPA agreement without even going into the details of vetting the fabrics of the PPA contract, which is very complex and costly if not properly handled. But by policy, my country favors renewable energy. As a country, we are a cradle of renewable energy sources. We have it in enormous amount, be it wind, geothermal, hydro, or solar. So the primary focus when think of engaging private financing in the energy sector, our choice and preference is renewable energy sources. As you know, renewable poses a bit of a challenge to the structure of commercial finance. It is not easy. It is very difficult in terms of scale of investment, types of risk associated with the energy source itself. And that's why oftentimes it is not a quick process. We have signed a PPA with a private sector geothermal developer, 150 megawatts still. That is a process of resource definition, excavation, digging, boreholing and testing, geophysics studies and so on. It's not coming online yet. The government have also declared to outstanding PPP negotiations. The interest was so enormous, the private sector to come into business, but the capacity to engage them institutionally was not so. And in the process, a new phenomenon came up regarding the method of procurement. The procurement based on negotiation oftentimes work in favor of the private sector because of low capacity in engaging detailed technical negotiation by African partners. So especially for certain technologies, solar and wind, competitive procurement process, and also to some extent for hydro, have been a method of engagement. And accordingly, PPP proclamation developed in our country. And tender floated for sizable amounts of particularly solar IPP projects, PPP projects, and winners identified. However, in the contract details, issue popped up what was not envisaged before during the time of promulgating the PPP law. It is about risk management, particularly convertibility, currency convertibility risk. What was a surprising thing is that we have discovered this competitive procurement process is capable of putting up enormous commercial pressure on service providers, which otherwise is very difficult to do through a negotiation, direct negotiation. So we got very low prices by the standard of the day. It's less than 3 US cents per kilowatt hour. But when it comes to this particular risk management, our law, especially the financial regulation, didn't easily lend itself to that kind of provisions in the contract agreement. For this reason, there have been contract cancellation, but we learned from past mistakes, and then Even the PP law has gone through a revision amendment, and also the financial regulation amended accordingly, so that private sector might also enjoy a degree of freedom in terms of currency convertibility. That's one way of risk management. But in general, the pace of development of engaging private sector development has not matched by capable institution from within. And the pace has been retarded, slow, painstaking, sometimes results in unnecessary delays. Otherwise, there is a good deal of awareness. We, as a country, have put a lot of public finance and infrastructure development. Until recently, I don't think that such huge amount of stride has ever been made elsewhere as far as public financing of infrastructure is concerned. And now the limit is also known by this experience. So there is a general tendency, commitment to make it happen, where that will be major intervention points for a very lubricated, easy flow private sector engagement in our infrastructure requires some further work, and I will come to this point perhaps in the continuing discussion.
Let me stay with you, Ato Gitahun, and with the follow-up question. Of course, you've explained to us very clearly some of the issues in the current situation of PPP. In Ethiopia, you do have a PPP proclamation, PPP law. Some of the challenges you mentioned, the capacity of the government side to negotiate with the private sector. And you also highlight some of the risk, one of which is currency convertibility. But let me stay with you and building on what you have already said. What will you say are existing frameworks at the country level to facilitate successful PPP adequately? So what is the framework? You already mentioned some of it. If you could build on that. And then can PPPs be undertaken in the country under existing laws or contracts, or do you need new ones to be enacted?
Thank you, Robert. This enterprise of engaging private sector in energy infrastructure finance is a very comprehensive one. It's supported by development partners. We have developed template contract documents, bidding documents are also made available, and still the support under pipeline, and projects are still applying. But the existing law, it has to be tested and in due course upgraded to catch up with new challenge. Recently, I came up with a new book published by the World Bank. It's about a guidebook how to develop or to draft a PPP law. I was surprised back in 2016-17 when we tried to draft PPP proclamation. We have consulted various best experiences. Even as national energy regulator in 2005 or 6, we have formed a platform for Eastern and Southern Africa energy regulators, what we call Rarisa under COMESA. Even under this platform, we have developed a kind of template PPP contract framework. We have used this to some extent, but nothing is the equivalent of what has been recently published just last year by the World Bank. So my personal desire, again, it will be a good thing to review our framework based on this vast compiled experience available to us, which was not available to us before. But the current law still in action and improving it, upgrading it as we face problem in engaging private sector finance. It is the interest we see from the world private sector is very amazing. application for one project of 150 megawatt could be as many as 80 applications. We have to devise certain criteria to reduce them based on their competence, credibility, financial capability, track record, whatever. There is huge interest, and like I said before, the uptake from our side is not quite moving according to the desired pace, mainly because of the institutional capacity. There is a PPP unit under Ministry of Finance. There is also a regulator, but institutionally, I believe there need to be a degree of independence of these institutions. And independent institution in law and in practice in our continent is very poor, as most of you know it. All government institutions are supposed to be an attachment, an appendix to the mainstream thinking of the political line. But in this particular case, institutions, those who regulate the market, the driving impetus to the decision is the force of market, the language of market, the trends of market, the information from the market, as opposed to political short-term interests. If decisions are compromised, that would frustrate potential interest for private sector investment. So independence is very much independence, financial independence of institutions, so that they can be budgeted from their own regulatory service and not from the exchequer, so that they can be dependent and the decision-making process is not hijacked by any level of echelon above or under, or even by corporate bodies. Independence and cost of capital inversely works. The more institutions who do in market, who decide in market features are independent, and the lesser will be cost of capital, and vice versa. We don't have that yet, and that's a must-have thing, so that investment in this sector can be leveraged to the desired extent. In the hydro cases, even though it is very difficult to get bidders when we float, once we float bid documents, but the return was very, very low, not fair enough, not adequate enough to solicit under that scenario, and that was abandoned. But it has to be non-competitive process, and to do that process, and capable institutions will be required to be a negotiating partner with the private sector. There are cases, many cases of failure in unequal negotiation between parties resulted into high price of energy and disagreement in contracts, variation requests, renegotiation requests, even court cases. And that will be the most horrible scenario, to assume that investment infrastructure would end up in court. That is something to be by all means avoided, and usually works against the host institution, against the host country.
Thank you so much, Ato. Let me move now to Asene. Asene, despite some of the crises you mentioned in Cameroon, the economy, you say, remain more or less. You also raised that just about 35% of projects reach implementation phase. And even in those projects, very few of them are completed in terms of implementation. So with that background, I come to you with the same question I asked Ato Gitahun. What would you say are existing frameworks in the country, Cameroon, to facilitate successful PPP? Building on that, can PPPs be undertaken in the country under existing laws, or do you foresee that new laws would want to be enacted? Because it's quite disturbing, 35% of projects signed as contract, and even within those, very few implemented.
Okay. Let me first come with a clarification. I want to underline that among PPP projects submitted to the PPP unit, we have about 35% that do not reach the implementation stage. And then for those reaching the implementation stage, about 15%, they are not achieved. They start implementation and then they do not achieve. That's the problem. Okay, coming back to your second question, and I'm turned back in French. Donc, parlant du cadre légal et réglementaire des PPP au Cameroun, oui, je peux déjà dire, oui, les PPP sont en train d'être mis en œuvre dans le cadre de ce cadre réglementaire. Mais pour parler de ce cadre réglementaire, je peux dire qu'il y a deux grands blocs. Le premier bloc, c'est ce qu'on appelle le régime général des partenariats publics-privés au Cameroun. Ce régime général s'organise dans le cadre de la loi qui a été votée, la loi de 2006, on l'appelle la loi PPP au Cameroun. En plus de cette loi, nous avons un décret du Premier ministre qui permet la mise en œuvre de cette loi. Et ce décret crée l'unité PPP, qu'on appelle le CARPA. C'est un conseil d'appui à la réalisation des projets de partenariat. Alors, ça, c'est le premier bloc. Au deuxième bloc, nous avons des lois qui sont des lois sectorielles. Par exemple, secteur mines, électricité, eau et assainissement. Nous avons des lois qui régissent les partenariats dans beaucoup de ces secteurs. Il y a au moins 8 ou bien une dizaine de secteurs qui n'entrent pas dans le cadre de la grande loi PPP. Alors, vous avez posé une très bonne question. Et c'est à partir de là que nous avons un petit souci. Parce que lorsqu'on regarde la loi, ce que je peux appeler la loi mère des PPP, qui donne naissance à l'unité PPP, et en face de cette loi, nous avons d'autres lois sectorielles. Alors, le problème qui se passe sur le terrain, c'est que d'abord, au niveau de ces lois, il y a chevauchement, il y a difficulté d'interprétation, difficulté de mise en œuvre des PPP. Alors, ça cause problème, quel que soit au niveau du secteur privé, quel que soit même au niveau de l'État. Ça, c'est le premier point. Le deuxième point, c'est que, officiellement, la loi camerounaise reconnaît une seule unité PPP. Mais dans la réalité, compte tenu de ces lois sectorielles, nous avons une pluralité de PPP, d'unités PPP. Et si on va très loin, on se rend compte que l'unité PPP officielle reconnue par la loi est relativement faible pour aller droit au but, n'a pas assez de capacité comme les régulateurs. Sont les régulateurs qui travaillent au niveau sectoriel. Donc, pour le suivi des partenariats publics-privés au Cameroun, nous avons l'unité PPP, officiellement reconnue, mais à côté de l'unité PPP, nous avons les régulateurs en fonction des secteurs. Régulateurs d'électricité, régulateurs d'eau et assainissement, régulateurs des télécoms, ainsi de suite, ainsi de suite. Alors, lorsqu'on regarde le travail sur le terrain, on se rend compte que les plus gros projets ne sont pas gérés par l'unité PPP. Donc, l'unité PPP ne connaît pas ce qui se passe dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre des projets, par exemple l'électricité. Si je prends le plus grand projet PPP au Cameroun, c'est le projet de la construction du barrage de Nakchigal, le plus grand sur le fleuve Sanaga, le plus grand fleuve du pays. Alors, c'est un partenariat public-privé avec la France, avec une société française, alors dont le coût s'élève à près de 1400 millions de dollars. Donc, c'est très costaud. Donc, ce projet, par exemple, n'est pas suivi par l'unité PPP. C'est suivi par le régulateur du secteur électricité. Je peux prendre un autre exemple. Le Cameroun est relié avec le Brésil par la fibre optique. Ça, c'est aussi un partenariat à travers un partenariat public-privé.
I'm being reminded that we don't have too much time.
Oh,
So
okay.
if you could wrap up that question,
Okay.
and then I'll come.
Donc, les plus grands projets ne sont pas suivis par l'unité PPP. Alors, à ce niveau, on constate donc que la loi, oui, elle permet de mettre en œuvre les partenariats publics-privés, mais il faudra l'améliorer quelque part pour minimiser les difficultés en termes de chevauchement, qui fait quoi, ainsi de suite. Donc, il y a beaucoup à faire à ce niveau. Merci.
Thank you. In the interest of time, and because I also want some direction from the experts on the floor, if you bear with me, Enie, I will take a few questions from the floor, and I promise you will be the first to answer, and you can touch on the PPP floor, because I know that. So, do we have any questions from the floor? I could take a couple of questions. I can see here, right there, and the second one. So let's take the questions.
Hello, this is a question to Enis. Is that Enis? Enis, right. See, you mentioned that PPPs are a manner of risk sharing, etc. I think it is more than risk sharing. Quite often PPP projects are evolved for transfer of management responsibilities as well, maybe with a minority share, if not a majority share in the project, and the revenue has to be shared with the government. Number one. Number two is there is a movement, including by your own WAP, of people's first PPPs. I don't think you spoke about people's first PPPs, in the sense that if PPPs are going to be targeted towards consumers, whether it's utilities particularly, whether there have been stakeholder consultation before the project was launched. Thirdly, the agenda also speaks about a lot of Chinese investment in infrastructure. Have the Chinese also invested in PPP projects in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Gabriel, economist. So the question is on regulations. From what the experience of Cameroons, it shows that there is a specific regulations for the sectors, and then there is a PPE regulations, and that creates something like a silos in terms of looking at the regulation holistically. What will be the right recommendations in terms of recommendations to bring these two, silos kind of regulations together? Thank you.
So what we'll do, I will ask NEA to respond to the direct question, and that will be your last intervention. So I would ask you as well to give us two critical points that you think should happen, measures that should be implemented to enhance the financing of infrastructure projects through PPPs.
Hello. Thank you, Robert. I'll just respond to the question first, if it's okay. You're right to say that PPPs are not just about risk sharing. But when I gave a brief description of what a PPP is, it was in the context that although it is a long-term contract between a public sector partner and a private sector partner, the idea here is for the government to say, I would like to sort of outsource a function or at least an infrastructure that belongs to the state to a private sector, because they are the best in service delivery, so to speak, to bring in that private sector innovation and expertise. So if you look at just high level, what are the sort of rationale for going with the PPP option in the first place? It's because, one, it provides government with access to a different option to financing, right? It helps relieve pressure on the fiscal space. It helps to also leverage private sector expertise, innovation, and managerial skills. And of course, it brings in that long-term maintenance approach. So it's quite a complex arrangement, but underlying it is the risk allocation or risk sharing factor, which actually determines the business case for the project. Because what is risk? Risk is really cost. So the idea here is that in a PPP arrangement, it's really around, when you're doing risk allocation, it is the party who is best able to manage a risk that should be the one taking on that risk. So typically in the PPP, when you look at financial, technical, operational risk, those are typical risks that the private sector will take. Things like regulatory risk, of course, that's like the government type of risk. So I just wanted to address that question about risk. I think your second point, I don't recall.
No, please, we're being told to finish. So please, if you just give us 2 measures,
yes,
because I'm being signaled to stop.
Yes, thank you. There's a lot to unpack, but I really like the fact that you brought that up, because that was what I was going to touch on. And I'll use that to answer the question from Robert to say, how should we be looking at PPP projects in terms of the connection with sustainability, sustainable development? So, the ECA has been sort of at the forefront of this People First PPPs. And what is People First PPPs? It's basically just advocating for like a new approach to looking at or delivering PPP projects, which sort of prioritizes sustainable development, putting people at the core of those projects, right? So this also ties into how our projects identified, screened, and prioritized. We see a lot of countries, I think my colleague from Cameroon talked about pipeline projects, about 35% not being implementable, right? But the idea here is now to be able to develop healthy, bankable projects that actually reflect the real needs of the people and tie into the sustainable development goals, right? So when you look at projects that sort of promote or increase access to water, energy, transportation, education, and the likes, those are the sort of projects that we'll see that will have a direct correlation to achieving the sustainable development goals. So just to your question
I feel terrible to intervene with you. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
No, it's
I
okay.
think we
Thank
can
you
take
very
it during the coffee break. But let me say, Hassan and Dr. Gitanyo, one minute each to wrap up. What is the takeaway? What measures should we take to scale up PPPs? 1 minute and 1 minute for Dr. Gitanyo.
Okay. Just to say that, and this, also to answer to this question, we need to unify our regulatory frameworks so that we can get only one and reduce the number of PPP units we as the act. And also, we need a capacity building of all the shareholders, and have to continue to promote better environment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Down 1 minute. What should we do to scale up PPPs on our continent?
Thank you. I shall say this. There is a commitment to get infrastructure developed so that industrialization come and save the future of this generation, the future of this Africa. And the immediate option we have is to engage private sector wisely, boldly, and with the necessary tact. For this to happen, it is the soft infrastructure, as somebody said it from the podium early this morning, institutional capacity in the regulator as well as in the PPP framework. Somebody asked about the two regulations, whether they may conflict or contradict each other. That is the wisdom of drafting PPP law, how it can take on board other regulation within itself so that the investor may not be subject to unnecessary procedures and delays. The second one is independence of institution, to act independently and to act based on market information. And the third one is to make this framework as stable as it should be. A variation and changes every now and then can't work against the interest of long-term investment.
Thank you. I think I have to apologize to the panelists. I think this is very much an unfinished discussion. There's a lot to say on what the private sector can bring in to the table and the PPPs. Let's continue the discussion during coffee break. I'm not going to attempt even to summarize the main conclusions because I see the organizers are impatiently signaling me to come down the stage. So I will stop here and please join me to give a round of applause to the panelists.